A woman stands before a medieval court, accused of witchcraft. Her crime? Stealing men's penises and keeping them as pets in a bird's nest, feeding them oats and corn like living creatures. This isn't fantasy. This isn't folklore. This is documented history. And it's just the beginning of a rabbit hole so deep, so twisted, that historians literally spent centuries pretending these records didn't exist. Everything you think you know about the Middle Ages is a lie. The chaste knights, the prudish peasants, the sexually repressed civilization waiting for the Renaissance to liberate them. Complete fiction. The reality was far stranger, far darker, and infinitely more insane than anything Hollywood ever imagined. This was a world where courts ordered wives to manually stimulate their husbands in front of judges, where pregnancy from assault legally proved you enjoyed it, where pigs were formally prosecuted for intimate relations with humans and could be acquitted if witnesses testified to their good character. These aren't legends. These are legal records, medical texts, church documents, all carefully preserved, all deliberately ignored. Welcome to medieval sexuality, a civilization so bizarre that the truth sounds like madness. The Catholic Church controlled everything, not just your soul, your bedroom, your body. Every thrust, every position, every moment of pleasure was monitored, cataloged, punished. They created a sexual calendar so restrictive that modern historians needed flowcharts just to understand it. Imagine being married in 13th century France. You love your spouse. The church itself bound you together in holy matrimony. Surely intimacy is permitted, even encouraged. Wrong. No sex on Sundays. That's the Lord's Day. None on Fridays. Christ died then. Thursdays forbidden to honor the Last Supper. None during Lent, 40 days gone. Advent, for weeks. Dozens of saints' feast days scattered throughout the year like landmines. But the calendar was just the beginning. Is your wife menstruating? Forbidden. She's unclean. Just had a baby? No touching for 40 days. Breastfeeding? Some priests declared that off limits too, claiming sexual activity would corrupt the milk and poison the infant. One German penitential prescribed 3 years of fasting on bread and water if a couple dared to be intimate while nursing. When scholars calculated all the forbidden days, they discovered something horrifying. A properly obedient Christian couple could legally have sex less than once a week. And even then, the rules for the act itself were suffocating. Only one position was acceptable: missionary. Everything else was sodomy, punishable by years of fasting. Woman on top? 40 days of penance. From behind? 3 years. Any position that impeded conception? 7 years. The Canons of Theodore, a 7th century manual still used throughout the medieval period, declared that anyone who ejaculated seed into the mouth had committed the worst evil. Worse than murder. Worse than heresy. The church even regulated enthusiasm. Too much pleasure? Sin. Making noise? Sin. Taking too long? Sin. One French bishop prescribed penance for couples who lingered in embraces or showed excessive affection. The ideal Christian sexual encounter, according to these manuals, should be brief, silent, purposeful, and performed without pleasure, as if compelled by duty alone. Think about that for a moment. The church was telling married couples to hate the act of creating life. Yet here's where the hypocrisy becomes almost comical. The same priests preaching these impossible rules were visiting brothels so regularly that the church simply started taxing them for it. The culegium, a fornication fee. Pay your bishop an annual sum. Keep your mistress without interference. We have the receipts. Actual financial records from medieval England and Germany listing these payments right alongside tithes and burial fees. In the Diocese of Norwich in 1450, church account books list the culegium between income from burials and baptisms as routine as any other revenue stream. In some German territories, 1/3 of parish priests were paying these fees. The monasteries were worse. Take the Nun of Wotton, documented by Aelred of Rievaulx in 12th century England. A young woman forced into the convent as a child became pregnant by a lay brother. When discovered, the other nuns didn't expel her or report her to the bishop. They captured her lover, dragged him before her, and forced her to castrate him herself. Then, according to Aelred's account, one senior nun grabbed the severed organs, still dripping blood, and shoved them into the pregnant girl's mouth. But here's the truly insane part. The chronicle claims her pregnancy then miraculously disappeared. divine absolution. The abbey welcomed her back. To them, the forced castration and humiliation weren't crimes. They were acts of spiritual purification. If this disturbing revelation shocked you, hit that like button, because what comes next is even darker. Medieval medicine transformed everything into a nightmare with its catastrophically wrong theories about reproduction. Physicians, following ancient Greek texts, believed women needed to orgasm to conceive. The two-seed theory. Both partners had to emit seed for pregnancy to occur. William of Conches, who tutored the future King Henry II, wrote extensively about this, arguing that without mutual pleasure and the emission of both seeds, generation cannot occur. This sounds almost progressive until you realize the legal implications. If conception required female pleasure, then pregnancy was proof of consent. The legal text Fleta from 13th century England states explicitly, if she should have conceived by the rape, the charge must be dropped, for without a woman's consent, she could not conceive. Read that again. Let it sink in. A woman suffers assault, becomes pregnant from it, and the pregnancy itself becomes proof she's lying. This wasn't some fringe belief. It was standard legal doctrine across medieval Europe. We have court records from England, France, and the Holy Roman Empire, all showing rape charges dismissed because the victim conceived. Lady Isabel Butler in 15th century Ireland was abducted, repeatedly assaulted, forced into marriage with her attacker. When she became pregnant, the courts ruled it couldn't have been rape. Her attacker kept her as his legal wife. Meanwhile, the same medical establishment was prescribing orgasms as treatment for other conditions. Women who went too long without sex supposedly suffered from womb suffocation or hysteria. The uterus would literally wander around the body, causing fainting, emotional disturbance, even seizures. The prescribed treatment for married women? Regular intercourse. For widows and unmarried women, manual stimulation by a midwife to provoke the necessary release. Medieval doctors were literally prescribing medical orgasms performed by healthcare providers. This practice continued for centuries and eventually led to the invention of the vibrator in the 1800s. But it started with medieval theories about wandering wombs. What do you think about these medical practices? Were they trying to help or control women? Let us know in the comments. But perhaps nothing captures the public spectacle of medieval sexuality better than the trial by Congress. When a wife sued for annulment claiming her husband was impotent, French courts needed proof. Their solution? Order the couple to attempt intercourse in front of witnesses. The procedure was methodical. The couple would be brought to a designated room, usually in the bishop's palace. A panel of matrons, older women considered experts in these matters, would first examine the man's genitals, checking for deformities. They might attempt to manually arouse him to test his capacity. If that examination proved inconclusive, then came the main event. The couple would be placed in bed, surrounded by curtains with strategic gaps for witnesses to observe. They were then ordered to attempt intercourse while the matrons watched for signs of erection, penetration, and completion. The pressure was crushing. The Marquis de Langy's case in 1659 became the scandal of Paris. Pamphlets and satirical poems circulated about whether the Marquis could or couldn't. He failed the test spectacularly, multiple times, though he later remarried and had children, proving the whole system was fundamentally flawed. The court records describe him wilting like a flower under the matron's gaze, unable to perform despite desperate attempts. For other sexual crimes, the punishments were designed to be as public and humiliating as possible. Adultery wasn't just a private sin. It was a public crime. Under the laws of King Nut in 11th century England, an adulteress would have her nose and ears cut off. This wasn't random cruelty. It was calculated humiliation. The nose in particular was symbolically important. Cutting it off destroyed a woman's beauty permanently, marking her as a sexual criminal for life. We have skeletal evidence from archaeological sites showing women with these exact mutilations. These weren't just threats. They were practiced punishments. But the most surreal aspect of medieval justice was how they prosecuted animals for sexual crimes. Bestiality was considered the absolute worst sexual sin. Worse than incest. Worse than sodomy. Worse than murder. Both human and animal faced execution, usually by burning. But here's the insane part. The animals were formally prosecuted as co-conspirators. They had defense attorneys appointed. Witnesses testified about their character. Verdicts were solemnly pronounced. We have hundreds of documented cases. A 16th-century French case involved Jacques Ferrin and a female donkey. He was convicted and burned. But the donkey's case went differently. Villagers testified to her virtuous behavior and innocence. The court records state she showed no sign of complicity and had been subjected to force. The donkey was acquitted and returned to her owner, while Ferrin burned at the stake. Other animals weren't so lucky. A cow in Normandy was burned alongside her human violator. Several pigs were executed for unnatural relations in various French provinces. One pig in 1386 was dressed in human clothing before execution to emphasize its participation in human sin. The reasoning was theological. Animals could consent to or resist evil. The contaminated animal had to be destroyed to purge the community of spiritual pollution. If you're shocked by how deep this rabbit hole goes, consider subscribing. We uncover history's darkest secrets every week, and trust me, it gets even stranger. Homosexuality faced equally bizarre persecution. Venice had specific drowning pools for sodomites. They would be tied between two columns at high tide and left to drown as the water rose. Spain's Siete Partidas mandated burning at the stake. But Florence took it furthest. In 1432, they created the Office of the Night, a special police force dedicated solely to catching men engaging in homosexual acts. The officers' methods were systematic. They patrolled known meeting spots, accepted anonymous denunciations dropped in special boxes around the city, and even employed young men as bait to entrap suspects. Over 70 years, they investigated 17,000 men, nearly half the adult male population, and convicted 3,000. The officers kept detailed records. Who was the active partner? Who was passive? Where they met? How often? First offenders got fines. Repeat offenders faced branding, pillory, or execution. During crises, sexual deviants became scapegoats. When the Black Death struck in the 1340s, numerous cities conducted purges. In Bruges, Jean van Aerden was burned at the stake in 1348 because authorities believed his sodomy had caused the plague. The court records state his unnatural lusts had poisoned the air itself. Similar executions happened across Europe as terrified communities tried to appease God by eliminating sexual sinners. The Knights Templar, once Christianity's most powerful military order, were destroyed partly through sexual accusations. When King Philip IV of France wanted to eliminate them and seize their wealth in 1307, he accused them of requiring initiates to kiss the anus of their superiors and engaging in homosexual orgies. These charges were almost certainly fabricated. Tortured Templars would confess to anything. But they worked because medieval society was primed to believe that heresy and sexual deviance were inseparable. By the late medieval period, sexual anxiety had merged completely with supernatural fears. The Malleus Maleficarum, the witch hunting manual of 1487, is obsessed with sex in ways that reveal more about the authors than any actual witches. It claimed witches routinely stole men's penises through magic. Here's an actual quote. Witches can truly and actually remove men's members. And sometimes they collect many such members together, 20 or 30 at once, and put them in a bird's nest or in a box where they move about like living members and eat oats and corn. The text includes a grotesque story. A man climbed a tree to retrieve his stolen penis from a witch's nest full of writhing members, only to be told he couldn't take the largest one because it belonged to the parish priest. This wasn't treated as folklore. Educated inquisitors believed it completely. Women were tortured into confessing they had stolen penises through witchcraft and executed for it. A mural in Massa Marittima, Tuscany from 1265 shows women harvesting penises from a tree like fruit. Medieval artists incorporated this into religious manuscripts. One 14th-century illustration shows a nun calmly plucking penises from a tree and collecting them in a basket. Now, let's address the famous myths. Droit du Seigneur, a lord's right to sleep with peasant brides on their wedding night. Complete fiction. Historians have found zero credible evidence of any such legal right in medieval Europe. What existed were marriage fees peasants paid to lords, which later propagandists transformed into sexual obligations to make the Middle Ages seem maximally barbaric. Chastity belts? Also fake. Every medieval chastity belt in museums has been proven to be either a 19th-century forgery or a Renaissance joke. The first known image appears in a 1405 military manual mixed with other fantasy devices like invisible armor and perpetual motion machines. It was satire. What was real were the municipal brothels, far stranger than any myth. Cities operated government-run whorehouses with church participation. In Southwark, London, the brothels were called the Bishop of Winchester's geese because the Bishop of Winchester licensed and taxed them. The bishop literally profited from prostitution while preaching against fornication every Sunday. These brothels had surreal regulations. In Nuremberg, married men couldn't visit on Sundays. Pregnant prostitutes had to leave until after birth. Jewish clients paid double. Prostitutes wore mandatory identifying clothes. Yellow hoods with bells in Leipzig. Black cloaks with yellow stripes in Milan. When Emperor Frederick III entered Nuremberg in 1471, the brothel women captured him at the gates with golden chains as part of the official welcome ceremony, only releasing him after he paid a ransom, which he did with good humor. Everything changed when syphilis arrived in 1494. This new disease spread from Naples to Scotland within 2 years, causing genital sores, body-covering rashes, and flesh literally rotting off faces. Cities that had operated brothels for centuries shut them down overnight. The pragmatic medieval system of regulated vice collapsed in the face of a disease that made sex potentially lethal. Noble marriages were called off when grooms showed symptoms. Prostitutes were locked in prison hospitals. That's the real tragedy of medieval sexuality. For all its bizarre rules and brutal punishments, the system was ultimately very human. It recognized that people would have sex regardless of what the church said. So it created escape valves, confession and penance, regulated brothels, marriage as outlet, every grotesque punishment, every insane belief. They were all attempts to impose order on the fundamental chaos of human desire. They failed, of course, but the monuments to that failure, the court records, the penitentials, the marginal penis trees, give us a window into a world far stranger and far more human than we ever imagined. A world where the gap between what people preached and what they practiced was so vast it became its own kind of madness. So here's the question that should keep you up at night. We look back at medieval sexuality and see insanity. We see hypocrisy. We see a civilization trapped between impossible ideals and undeniable reality. What will future generations see when they look back at us? What are we pretending about sex and power and control right now that will seem just as insane 500 years from today? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more disturbing truths about history's darkest secrets, join our community of truth seekers. Hit subscribe, because the past is far stranger than anyone wants to admit. And we're just getting started.